So this week the focus of the class is the 1960s. And right at the beginning of the lecture, I want you to pause the video for a moment and just to take a look at some of the images that you see here in the front PowerPoint. How many can you identify? It really shows that the 60s had an enormous long-term influence on our culture. Now, what are our learning outcomes for this week? We want to describe the experiences John F. Kennedy had while president that led some to label him the ultimate Cold Warrior. Discuss attempts made by both African Americans and by the legal system to provide voting and other rights to black citizens. We want to discuss Lyndon Johnson's desire to build a great society and evaluate the relative success of his programs. Explain the Cold War origins of the Vietnam War and evaluate the decisions Johnson made that pushed the war into the forefront of Americans' minds. And we want to discuss the growth of the counterculture in American society during the 1960s, the coming together of protesters against American culture and protesters challenging the war, and describe the various movements that began to gather strength as Americans with an agenda sought to have their voices heard. The beginning of the 1960s corresponds with the presidential election, and we have Vice President Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy, a senator from Massachusetts, vying for the presidency. Now, this election is unique. It is the first presidential election after television. So it will be the first presidential election where there is a debate that airs on the TV. And what is so interesting about this presidential debate is this is during a middle period where there are still many Americans that are engaging with politics through the radio rather than television. And it's interesting to see the dichotomy that exists in the American people with perception and who they thought won the debate, depending on whether they were watching television or whether they were listening to it on the radio. Individuals who had the clues of looking in at these candidates, upwards of 90% of all communication is nonverbal. And those Americans that were able to watch the two candidates on television thought that Kennedy presented a much more formidable, much more presidential figure than Richard Milhous Nixon did. Nixon's eyes were shifting. He had sweat coming out of his brow, where John F. Kennedy was the quintessential man of the era, just a GQ type of figure. Clean cut, good looking, looked good in a suit, articulate, and people who watched TV thought that he clearly won the debate. Individuals that didn't have access to the visual context clues thought that Nixon won the debate, those that had listened to it on the radio. It was a very close election. If we look at the popular vote breakdown, 34,200,000 for Kennedy versus 34,100,000 for Nixon, with Byrd playing an independent, Spoiler in the Deep South capturing Mississippi and Alabama. Who knows who would have caught those votes had Byrd not been part of the presidential dynamic. Now, Kennedy will win this election, and he will galvanize the youth. That's one of the things that he brought into public service. And because of his youthful vigor, and in one of President Kennedy's most famous lines, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, he's really putting his finger on the pulse of youth culture in the 1960s. We talked last week about how the 1950s was considered rather blasé and conformist, and there was a lot of young people who were looking to break out of that mold, break out of that box, and Kennedy seemed to represent that at the presidential level. So young people were very engaged in the political process, and so under Kennedy, public service became an honor. And we see on March 1st, 1961, the Peace Corps is going to be founded. These are American volunteers that go to the developing world and help with doing good works, building schools, digging wells, etc. And it also helps in the Cold War dynamic that there are Americans going out and doing good works in countries that aren't aligned either with the Soviet Union or the United States. And through these good works, perhaps they're going to shift the hearts and minds of those individuals and have them come closer to the American camp rather than the Soviet camp. We're also going to see an increase in Social Security and minimum wage for Americans during the Kennedy administration. And Kennedy's going to articulate something called a new frontier. Quote, "We stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of the 1960s, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils, the frontier of unfulfilled hopes and unfilled threats. The frontier of unfilled hopes and unfilled threats. Beyond that frontier are uncharted areas of science and space, unsolved problems of peace and war, unconquered problems of ignorance and prejudice, unanswered questions of poverty and surplus." So if we break Kennedy's new frontier down, what is it that he's actually saying here? Well, he's articulating. So what is it that Kennedy is articulating with this new frontier? Well, there's unfinished business insofar as the civil rights movement is concerned. Kennedy recognizes that. There's unfinished business insofar as the Cold War is concerned. Kennedy recognizes that as well. And there's also space exploration, that the United States has fallen, it seems, woefully behind the Soviet Union, and he wants the United States to catch up and surpass the Soviet Union in space exploration. And those are going to be the keystones of his administration and its policies. So we need to take a little harder look at all of these. Now, the new frontier, one of them was a goal for civil rights improvements. But unfortunately, Kennedy was not able to pass legislation to meet that goal. He was dealing with an obstructionist Capitol Hill, especially the Senate. So any type of civil rights legislation that he moved towards or tried to compel Capitol Hill to pass failed. And that was because there's this schism within the Democratic Party that hasn't fully been resolved yet at the national level. Southern Democrats did not want to pass civil rights legislation. Kennedy is a Northerner. He's from Massachusetts. And his attempts to put the country on a trajectory of greater equality would be stymied by these Southern Democrats. Now, just because at the highest levels of politics, Kennedy was not able to get much done insofar as civil rights was concerned, there are still people on the streets who are trying to take agency and control over their lives and improve them. And so it will be up to African Americans and Americans who are committed to civil rights to get the job done themselves at the local level. And perhaps one day Washington, D.C. and the country will catch up. But they weren't going to stop. Rosa Parks and the civil disobedience movement that Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference put into place to try and chip away at the Jim Crow South continued unabated. And we have to remember, this is the era of TV. And the civil rights movement is going to use this new medium very effectively in getting their vision across to the American people as to what exactly is going on in the South. And President Kennedy, like many Americans, are going to see TV images such as this, where peaceful protesters are set upon by police dogs. And Kennedy will say himself that this made him sick. And so he's going to try what he can to help the civil rights movement, sans legislation coming from Congress. With the arrival of television, Americans could watch the news every day, and they could see the nonviolent civil disobedience that's used by King and the other civil rights protesters, and it makes them look like they are reasonable, good people, and their opponents look hateful and violent. And Dr. King was an amazing and inspiring orator. He knew what and could sway people to change their hearts and minds through the speeches that he gave. Now, one of the first flashpoints of civil rights in the 1960s will take place in Greensboro, North Carolina, where 4 college students will go into a Woolworth's that does not allow blacks to be served at the counter, and they will sit down and request a cup of coffee. They will be denied, and they will stay there. And day after day, they will return. This movement, what they are doing, starts to gain traction in the press, and it spreads. And more students and more African Americans go into Woolworths and stores like them, asking to be served. They will be denied, and they won't leave. This movement will start in February 1st of 1960 and go on to July 25th of 1960. And here in this slide, we can see the type of behavior of, and as the word spreads that these sit-ins are taking place, white students will sit down right next to African American students as a show of support, and also wait for their compatriots to be served. And this is going to bring in the segregationists, and they will look to antagonize and wait for these individuals to respond so they can tear them apart, basically. Just look at this image. Covered in mustard, having cigarettes put out on you, Coca-Cola poured over your head. It takes a lot of discipline to stay graceful in the face of all of this hate. And it's being caught live on television and beamed into homes across the country and across the world. And like with the bus boycotts that had taken place in the 1950s, the economic imperative to get their business generating income again, businesses will start to fold, and they will cave into the demands of the civil rights protesters and begin to serve African Americans at the counter. At the height of the sit-in movement, 70,000 students will have participated in sit-ins in the South to try and desegregate businesses. Because of these victories, and in the wake of these victories, students in the South come together and start to ask, well, what can we do next? That was a victory. And they organize. And we see the creation of something called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in May of 1960. And the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee will look to practice nonviolence, and they will call for an racially integrated America. And young people are going to be especially important to the civil rights movement because they were immune to many of the pressures that the older generations felt that kept them in line. They didn't have loans that could be called in. They didn't have jobs that they were vested in with pensions that could be on the line because they were working there for 20 years and they could be fired if they decided to act out of line or out of step with the social norms in the South. And we can see the importance of the students in the next major flashpoint of the civil rights movement, the Freedom Riders. These were individuals who were committed to desegregating interstate transportation facilities and bus lines. The Freedom Riders started with an organization called CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. It had been founded during the Second World War, and this was one of its major. The Supreme Court, in one of its landmark decisions, had banned segregation on interstate bus routes. And so CORE was going to put this judicial And so CORE's aim is through direct action to make sure that the Supreme Court decision to ban segregation on interstate bus routes takes place in reality. They are met with overwhelming violence. On May 14, 1961, a bus that's going into Alabama is set upon by segregationists who bomb the bus, and as the bus is on fire and the individuals are coming out of it, they are set upon by individuals with bricks and bats and tire irons who beat them mercilessly. When these individuals go to the local hospital to try and get assistance, the hospital will not help them. The police will not interfere in Alabama, saying that it's the core freedom riders who are the rabble-rousers creating the problems, and not the segregationists that are doing the violence. CORE has to back down. They have to stop the freedom rides. And it's actually the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee that picks up the mantle once again and continues with the freedom rides. Now, President Kennedy is going to do what he can for these individuals, sans legislation, because nothing is getting done on Capitol Hill. So he's going to use the bullets that he has available to him. So Kennedy is going to use the means that are available to him. And that's going to be federal marshals that will go into the South to help protect these freedom riders from being set upon by mobs. Additionally, in September of 1962, there will be new policies that are put in place by the Interstate Commerce Commission, where signs are placed everywhere in interstate bus facilities to let individuals know that seating on the buses is without regard to race, color, creed, or national origin. These freedom rides are going to continue the policy of non-action. They're going to continue the interracial commitment that you see with whites and blacks on these buses together. And again, the importance of TV, showing the stark contrast between the behavior of the peaceful, nonviolent individuals that are just looking for the law to be implemented, and the individuals who are in the South waiting for them with bricks and tire irons to do them harm. Now, since the Brown v. Board of Education case that we examined last week, civil rights, segregation insofar as education is concerned, was a flashpoint in the civil rights movement. James Meredith, an African-American male, is going to attempt to enroll at the University of Mississippi. Mississippi is a state that has been majority African-American since before the United States was even a country. And he's going to be the first African-American that will enroll at the University of Mississippi in September of 1962. Predictably, his attempts to try and get an education are obstructed not only by street violence, but also political violence perpetrated upon him by Governor Ross Barnett. And there will be mobs surrounding the University of Mississippi to attempt to stop him from getting an education. So President Kennedy is again going to do what he can for the civil rights movement, and he's going to send in federal marshals to protect Meredith while he attends the University of Mississippi. President Kennedy will also go on television and appeal to the nation to allow James Meredith and other individuals like him to progress through life and uplift themselves through education. Clearly, despite the friction, there is a momentum that's building within the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King and the other leaders of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference decide that they are going to have a march to Birmingham, which is considered the most racist city in America. And they're going to try and attempt. Birmingham is considered the most segregated city in America. And Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference want to do something about this. So they're going to demonstrate and march in Birmingham. The mayor forbids it, but it doesn't matter. Martin Luther King will arrive into the city with 20,000 protesters. And they're bringing children with them, often dressed in their Sunday best, their church clothes. And so we have these very respectable Americans protesting for equal treatment under the law, and they are set upon by this public safety official named Bull Connor. That was the image that we saw earlier in the PowerPoint presentation, where there is a student that had a dog about to clamp down on his arm. Well, here are some of the other images that we see here. Part of the Birmingham desegregation movement was something called the Birmingham Children's Crusade, where thousands of school students joined the movement to desegregate Birmingham. And it made no difference to Connor and his police forces. They treated them with as much rancor as they treated an adult that was part of this movement, spraying them with high-powered hoses that flayed the skin off of their backs. Dogs were set upon them as well, and they were arrested. Martin Luther King will be arrested and will pen one of the most important letters in American history called Letter from a Birmingham Jail. I encourage everyone to take a look at it and read it. And we already mentioned how the images from this Birmingham movement made President Kennedy sick. It made a lot of Americans sick. It made a lot of human beings across the globe sick. And then the straw that broke the camel's back was during a church service. The 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, was firebombed. 4 children were killed, many people were injured. And the pressure on the Kennedy administration to do something about this was mounting, as millions of Americans were seeing what was happening really for the first time through the lens of television in the Deep South. So President Kennedy is going to use some soft power here. He is going to contact the leaders of the white. He's going to contact the white leaders of Birmingham and appeal to their sense of decency to try and come to a solution as to what's going on in their city. And the end result was another victory for the civil rights movement. These white leaders sat down with black leaders and they came up with a desegregation plan. And parks and other public facilities were desegregated in the wake of the Birmingham March. Moreover, city jobs that were before denied to African Americans were now opened up for them to apply and be hired for as well. Just 2 months later, our next flashpoint in the civil rights movement in the early 1960s rears its head at the University of Alabama, where there is a plan to integrate the university, and there's this famous picture of the governor of the state, George Washington, standing in the schoolhouse doors with police officers to deny African Americans the right to move through that doorway and get an education. And this is another moment where, sans any type of legislation coming from Capitol Hill, President Kennedy has to work with the tools that he has available to him, and that's federal power. So he's going to, just like Eisenhower in Little Rock, send federal troops to enforce the desegregation of the University of Alabama. Now, these are all victories for the civil rights movement, but they're coming at tremendous cost, not only for the individuals whose lives are destroyed or ended in the wake of the violence, but also for the perceptions of what the United States is really like for different peoples and countries around the world. We talked about it last week with the Cold War civil rights. Do countries in the non-aligned areas of the globe really want to become part of the United States' umbrella of values when this is the type of values it's showing it holds dear? So the next place that the civil rights movement moves towards to bring light upon what's going on in the United States is to Washington, D.C. itself. And in August 1963, civil rights leaders, including Martin Luther King Jr., are going to plan and organize a march on Washington where 250,000 people will show up in Washington, D.C. and demand federal movement on civil rights legislation. They converge on the nation's capital, and Martin Luther King gives his amazing and famous "I Have a Dream" speech. And as a result of the March on Washington, Washington, D.C. and the political class begin to wake up. And long term, we're going to see the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that will be passed. And we'll take a look at that in a little bit. But the March on Washington is going to be important because it takes the fight directly to the corridors of power in the country, where the influence makers are, where the lawmakers are, Washington, D.C. Now, the new frontier, for the most part, in regards to civil rights, proved elusive for Kennedy during his administration. Where Kennedy saw most successes in his new frontier concept was in the space race. The United States was clearly behind. Sputnik showed that. And then when Yuri Gagarin and then the Soviet Union showed again that the United States was behind when on April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin, one of their cosmonauts, was the first human being to circle the Earth in orbit in outer space. John Glenn will be the first American to orbit in 1962. So how does the United States capture the high ground again insofar as the technological aspects of the Cold War and the space race are concerned? Well, Kennedy articulates the concept that we need to put a man on the moon by 1970. And we don't do these things because they are, quote, easy. We do them because they are hard. And the United States will be the first country to put a person on the moon. It happens in 1969 under the Nixon administration, but it's really Kennedy who throws down the gauntlet to the American people. And then he starts to fund the NASA to a much greater degree. And the United States captures the high ground again insofar as the space race is concerned by putting a man on the moon. Now, there's a dark side to the space race. One thing that was an accident of history, really, was that when Russia and the United States were invading Germany at the end of World War II, the best rocket scientists in the world were German. The Germans had tested a V-2 rocket at the end of the war, firing these missiles into Great Britain, hoping that they could achieve some sort of technological breakthrough that would allow them to seize victory from the jaws of defeat. It didn't happen. But what wound up happening was most of the rocket labs and rocket scientists were found on the eastern side of the country. So the Soviet Union was able to scoop up all of these German rocket scientists and, of course, bring them back to the Soviet Union to work on the Soviets' rocket technology and rocket programs. This was one of the contributing factors for why the Soviet Union had leapt past the United States insofar as missile technology was concerned. And you can put a man into outer space, a man or a woman in outer space with a rocket, but you can also use that technology, tweak it a little bit, and put some sort of devastating military warhead on the tip of that rocket as well. And so that was one of the major concerns that was in the background insofar as the space race is concerned, that the Soviet Union is going to have intermediate range missiles by 1962, and then intercontinental ballistic missiles, missiles that can not only fly from, say, Germany to Great Britain, but from Russia to the United States. Now, the Soviet Union has a missile that can go from Moscow to Washington, D.C., and put a hydrogen warhead on top of that, a hydrogen bomb warhead on top of that. You can see how that could be concerning for the American people and American policymakers. And why the United States needed to catch up. So let's segue now into JFK and international affairs. What's going on in the Cold War, the greater Cold War itself? When Kennedy first becomes president, the Joint Chiefs of Staff come to him and let him know that under the Eisenhower administration, the CIA and the Pentagon had been working up plans to invade Cuba. Why? Well, because in 1959, a charismatic individual by the name of Fidel Castro took power and established a communist regime on the island. Talk about a very important domino in the New World. Cuba is 90 miles off the coast of the United States, and now it's a little base of communist activity. The Eisenhower administration saw this as a threat, and so worked up plans in anticipation of removing Fidel Castro from power. Now, ironically, Eisenhower was out of power before this plan could be implemented, so the Joint Chiefs of Staff and CIA operatives that were working on it present the plan to Kennedy. Kennedy has his reservations, but he's a new president. He doesn't want to look weak, particularly internationally, insofar as relations with the Soviet Union is concerned. And so he goes ahead and approves this plan that the Pentagon and CIA had come up with. And the plan was to introduce roughly 1,200 to 1,400 commandos. These are Cuban exiles that were living in the United States that were trained by the CIA to return to Cuba and spark a counter-revolution against Fidel Castro. It was an unmitigated disaster, mostly due to the fact that Castro knew that they were coming. So when these commandos land at the Bay of Pigs on April 17, 1961, it's a disaster. The majority of them are captured. And what's Kennedy going to do now? Is he going to try and salvage the operation by introducing regular American forces to bail out these commandos? Is he going to deny that he knows anything about this operation? Kennedy chose the more conservative approach and decided not to do anything. And so that resulted in 1,200 of these commandos being put on trial and thrown into Cuban prisons. Some were even executed. Now, Kennedy, in order to get these individuals out of Cuban prisons, basically paid a bribe of $53 million to the communist Cuban regime and also provided medical supplies and other equipment. It was an embarrassment for Kennedy, and he never forgot it. And of course, the whole time that the Bay of Pigs fiasco was happening, the Soviet Union and the Soviet leaders are watching. Stalin is no longer in power. He has passed away. His replacement as premier of the Soviet Union is a gentleman by the name of Nikita Khrushchev. Nikita Khrushchev and Kennedy had met in 1960 in Vienna. Now, just 2 months after this fiasco, this major embarrassment for Kennedy at the Bay of Pigs, he's scheduled to meet Nikita Khrushchev in Vienna on June 4th, 1961. The meeting doesn't go well. Kennedy senses that the meeting doesn't go well. And Nikita Khrushchev walks away from that meeting with Kennedy, and he is entirely unimpressed with JFK. He looks at him and he just sees him as this rich, elite American, and he is going to run circles around him. We have to remember that Khrushchev is coming from a political world completely different than Kennedy, where if you make a mistake, you could wind up in the basement of the Kremlin with a bullet in the back of your head. And some Soviet leaders did have that happen to him. And Khrushchev decides, all right, this is a weak, young, inexperienced president. I'm going to test him. And so on August 13th, 1961, construction of the Berlin Wall begins in the middle of the night. And the West Berlin and East Berlin are cut off from one another due to that wall. Now, there's a reason why Khrushchev was doing this. Of course, we had we had already examined that the introduction of the Deutschmark and the economic power that that currency had in Berlin, insofar as the currency that was being used by the communist side is concerned, created a lot of questioning for the individuals, the Germans that lived in the Soviet-occupied side of the country. What exactly is going on in relation, in comparison with our economic system and the economic system that's being put in place in the American zone? And this dynamic is going to continue throughout the period. And so there are individuals that are in the Eastern zone, in the Soviet zone, that are trying desperately every single day to sneak into West Berlin and stay there. And so Khrushchev is going to put this line in the sand, this wall that stretches from one side of Berlin to the other. The Soviet Union makes a wall to keep them in. And Kennedy can do nothing but vocalize protestations about it, but forcefully cannot do anything. And all of his appeals to Khrushchev to knock this wall down, they go unanswered. So Khrushchev, unimpressed with Kennedy at Vienna, unimpressed with Kennedy's response to the building of the Berlin Wall, is going to push further. And we'll take a look at that in a second. But what happens in other parts of JFK's portfolio when it comes to foreign affairs? He's advocating a concept called nation building. And American policymakers have become addicted and enamored to the concept that America can go into some place around the world and basically terraform it into a new society based off of free market capitalism and democratic ideals. Now, America has fallen into this trap because of the overwhelming success that the United States had in transforming Nazi Germany and fascist Japan into mirror images of the United States insofar as economics and politics are concerned. And Kennedy's going to fall into this trap as well, that the United States can go into other parts of the world and do what it did in Germany and Japan again. It has not been that successful. And with the exception of South Korea, that has not been the case for the most part. So this nation building, what is it? Facilitating the economic and political maturation of developing nations in order to prevent the adoption of communism. Well, where is this going to take place? In the Kennedy administration? Certainly Vietnam can be looked at as a place where the Kennedy administration is going to try and engage in nation building. We already know, without having many of the details, that that's not going to be the case, that this nation building is going to fail. So what are some of the other key aspects of Kennedy's foreign affairs? What are some of the other key aspects of Kennedy's international policy? Well, he creates something quite quickly after the Bay of Pigs, because he has egg all over his face, the Alliance for Progress. March 1961, he's going to propose a 10-year, multi-billion-dollar aid package for Latin America. Well, Cuba is a Latin American country, and the other countries in the New World are looking at the United States and saying, okay, here we go again. Here's an example of the United States using its power to engage in imperialism in North or South America, because it is by far the most powerful country and dominates that area and claims that area through the Monroe Doctrine as its sphere of influence. And so other countries in South America and Latin America are looking at what happened in Cuba and saying, well, if it can happen in Cuba, it can happen in any of our countries. So this was a way to try and So the Alliance for Progress can best be considered a way that the Kennedy administration tries to improve the United States' relations with Latin America, which had been severely damaged because of not only the affair with the Bay of Pigs, but other interventions that had taken place for at least 100 years in Latin America. Now, Cuba is a particular thorn in the side of the United States because of that proximity. It's so close to the United States. And Americans had invested in that island to a greater extent than almost any other country in Latin America. So there are many Americans that had a lot to lose with Fidel Castro taking this country and making it communist. And so an analysis of JFK's administration insofar as Cuban affairs are concerned and this Cuban Missile Crisis that happens from October 16, 1962 to October 28, 1962 requires further analysis. And that's where we'll pick up the lecture next.